this section, we're going to talk about the War of 1812, and you'll see there that graphic tells you that the War of 1812 was also called Mr. Madison's War. Mr. Madison, of course, being James Madison, who was president when war was declared. James Madison is also, you should remember, a noted Republican, or Democratic Republican, and you can see it's labeled the controversial war because one of the things we're going to talk about is how it was not supported by all segments of the population. Another name for the War of 1812 is the Second War of American Independence, and we're going to get to that at the end. But take a look at your objective, as always with wars, causes, course, and consequences. So when we're talking about major causes of the war, the two most direct causes are ones that are familiar to you, of course. Great Britain has been arming Native Americans in the Northwest Territory there. They've also continued, despite our repeated calls for them to stop, they've continued impressment of American sailors, so kidnapping them and forcing them to serve in the British Navy. Remember that a large reason that's happening is because Great Britain is also in the midst of a war with France. Napoleon is attempting to take over all of Europe, and Great Britain is attempting to keep Napoleon from doing that, not for noble reasons, but because they don't want France to become too powerful. Another thing is we have this rise of nationalism, or love and pride for one's country. That's starting to develop more and more, and American pride continues to be hurt as the British are mistreating Americans. They are, of course, arming the natives against us. Not only that, but also doing everything they can to stop our trade with France, just as France is doing the same. So all of this leads to the rise of a group called the War Hawks. And of course, one of your test questions, I think I refer to them as the Hawks. If you can remember that they're the War Hawks, then you'll remember that those are the people who were very supportive of a war against Great Britain. It shouldn't surprise you that these people are Republicans, because remember, the Federalists generally supported Great Britain, whereas the Republicans supported France and naturally were against Great Britain as the enemy of France. So Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun are two guys that are the figureheads of this War Hawk movement. I make you learn their names because they're going to become important because they're not going to go away. But they're two men who get elected into the House of Representatives and really start to push the country towards this idea of a declared war against Great Britain. Now, it shouldn't surprise you that New England is the one region that consistently opposes this war, largely out of fear that it will hurt their trade. Remember that these New Englanders are going to be largely the trading group, and these traders are going to be hurt by losing the ability to trade with the country with which they have the closest trading relationship. Recall that before we even declared independence, of course, we had a heavily established method of trading with Great Britain as our mother country. I put up here the electoral map of 1808. I wanted to remind you, as we've looked at the electoral maps, we looked at 1796, and you saw that the country was very divided regionally, and that's still the case here. However, as you can see, the Federalist region is kind of shrinking, and the Republican region is expanding, which is why, of course, the Republican Madison won, the Democratic Republican Madison won this particular election. Do notice that there are Federalist strongholds, but it shouldn't surprise you that those two Federalist strongholds that are outside of New England are along the sea, where you would expect a lot of trade. So, arming the Native Americans, impressing sailors, developing sense of mistreatment at the hands of Great Britain. These are all the reasons that lead up to declaration of the War of 1812. So we'll take it in steps. We'll start with the early part of the war. As you may recall, Jefferson, as part of his big small government move, that's weird to say big small government, sorry, as part of his small government move, remember his quote that the best kind of government is the kind that restrains us from injuring each other and otherwise leaves everybody the heck alone? Well, remember that one of his things he wanted to do was shrink the size of the government, and although he didn't see it coming, apparently, this weakened the military, and by weakening the military, we're setting ourselves up to really struggle in the early part of this war. The military was down to 16 warships as compared to the 135 that the British had just here in America, and fewer than 7,000 men. Sorry, that should clearly be men. The British, one of the first things that they institute as part of the War of 1812 is a blockade. And what a blockade does is cut off a port. Now, usually you blockade one port. As you can imagine, it would be difficult to blockade an entire American coastline, but the British set out to do it. Like I said, they have 135 warships to our 16, whose whole purpose is just to keep any ships from getting in or out. Now, I want you to compare this idea to the idea of an embargo, and you can be sure I'm going to ask you to do this in class. An embargo is made by the Americans, was a decision by the Americans to choose not to trade with Great Britain or France. A blockade is when an outside party does it to you. So the British have done this to us. They've blocked off our ports to try to keep us from being able to trade either in or out. It's really rough in the early part of the war. The one bright spot is the USS Constitution, one of our warships, which won a noted battle. It's noted because it's one of the only occasions when we won. But in our history, it's a noted battle. They defeated a British warship called the Guerriere, but it earned its nickname, and you'll hear this in different places. The USS Constitution was called Old Ironsides, and it was called Old Ironsides because it was made of really thick wood. No, I'm serious. The sides of that ship, take a look. You can see, of course, this one is going to be the American ship. This is going to be the USS Constitution. The hull of the ship, or the sides of the ship, were made of very, very thick wood, so thick that it was as if it was reinforced with iron, but it wasn't. In the west and the south is where the war is going to head next, and we'll use this map kind of to give us a good idea of it. Take a look first, if you would, at the British ships. This symbol, of course, represents the British ships that are blockading the port, and of course, they're not stupid. They also are going to blockade New Orleans, which is part of the Louisiana Purchase, which we have just purchased, as you know, from France. The one that I am about to talk to you about is going to be here. So it starts off in the west and the south. The west especially, we're fighting with the British for control of the Great Lakes, which, as you can imagine, are crucial for trade, and the Mississippi River, which, as you can imagine, is crucial for trade. Remember that the British still control Canada. So when we're talking about the Great Lakes, which of course connect, and you have Lake Erie, which connects to Lake Ontario, and the St. Lawrence, which will connect all the way out to the Atlantic Ocean. So you can imagine why this is so important. That's what the area of land that we're generally fighting over. In early 1812, well, in July of 1812, we have an American general named William Hull. I'm not going to make you memorize his name because he failed, but he's going to lead an invasion of Canada, which is, of course, British Canada. The hope is that if we could maybe take control of, and we tried this during the Revolutionary War as well. The hope was that we could take control of the British capital in Canada and thus get them to surrender. Hull's not a great leader, and he hesitates, and as a result, he is defeated. So he attempts to take Canada, actually ends up getting 2,000 of his troops captured, and is a notable loss for us. Now, one slightly more impressive victory comes a year later, and you have Oliver Hazard Perry. You do need to learn his name because he succeeded. Here's him. He fought a series of naval battles with the British in Lake Erie, and take a look. Remember why this would be a crucial water port. He managed to defeat them, even though the flagship of his particular fleet is captured. He ends up on a different ship, and he gives us this dramatic message of, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." That's the quote for which he is known. So he doesn't give up, and he ultimately defeats the British in a battle called Put-in Bay, but that happens in Lake Erie. General Harrison, as you recall, you should remember General Harrison because he became notorious in the Battle of Tippecanoe. He defeated important Native American forces. He's not going to stop there. He's going to be sent to pursue the British troops who are retreating into Canada, and he is going to defeat them. The British are, of course, going to ally with Native Americans. Now, we have a few groups on our side as well. The Native Americans are going to ally with both groups, but he's going to pursue the British all the way up to the Battle of Thames. And in that, one of the more significant events, aside from that it is a notable American victory, is that Tecumseh is going to be killed. Remember that Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet, were important Native American leaders who were attempting to unify the tribes against the invading Americans. He's going to be killed at this particular battle, which is going to really strike a blow to Native American political organization. Now, finally, but certainly not least, you have Andrew Jackson. Now, you're vaguely aware of Andrew Jackson, but this is before he becomes president, obviously. And it's a lot of these events that we're going to talk about, which are going to help to make his legacy and, of course, help him to be elected. I told you that William Henry Harrison is largely going to run for president on the slogan of Tippecanoe. He's going to take Tippecanoe as a nickname to remind everyone of his victory against the Native Americans. Jackson's going to do a very similar thing. So Jackson's going to defeat a group of Creek Indians or Creek Native Americans at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And then I'll show you this because it's right here. Later, actually after the peace treaty has been signed, because the only word can't travel terribly quickly. They can't text each other. So in one of the more brutal and important battles, even though it happens after the war is over, he's going to win an important victory. He's going to defeat the British at New Orleans. And that's, again, actually going to happen after the peace treaty of Ghent is signed. But those are some of the most important battles, especially in the West, which is really the Northwest, and the South. Now, the final battles, and we'll go back to the map for a second. In 1814, Great Britain is finally going to defeat Napoleon. The French leader, is going to be defeated. So that's going to free up Great Britain to devote a lot more troops and a lot more forces to this war in America. So this could spell some danger for us. And true to form, in August of 1814, the British invade Washington, D.C., that new capital, and they actually burn the White House. Now, you know that the war is going poorly for you when your capital gets burnt. So here you have it. The White House at that time being burned. In September, they're going to move on. The British are going to move on and attempt to take Baltimore. And this is going to be a little bright spot because the Americans are going to successfully defend Baltimore. The British aren't going to be able to take it. And this is a crucial event in our history because this is actually when the Star-Spangled Banner gets composed. That should actually be an I. The young Francis Scott Key, upon watching as the British continue to bombard Fort McHenry in Baltimore. He's going to watch that, and when he sees in the morning the American flag still flying and our flag was still there, he's going to be inspired to write this poem, which is ultimately going to be set to music and later made by Congress into the national anthem. Then there you'll see the actual final battle, which was, I told you, I mentioned a couple times before, which was actually after the treaty was signed, was when Jackson defeats the British at New Orleans. So take a look back at the map. Here you have this, thanks to the British being done with fighting the French, they are able to stage yet another invasion. Obviously, the British blockade is going to let a British ship through in order to do this invasion, and they're going to invade D.C. and Baltimore, and then, of course, that final battle at New Orleans. This is an image, a painting, which depicts a fairly well-known story in which this woman here, her name is Dolly Madison, and she is the wife of James Madison. And she is believed to, the legend goes that as she was fleeing the White House, she saw the British troops massing, and she knew that they were coming and that had become obvious that the Americans weren't going to be able to defend the White House, that they were going to have to flee. They were going to have to flee and run away. It's said that she was in the middle of writing a letter to her sister. That's where this story comes from. She told her sister that she was preparing her things in order to run, but that she would not leave until this image or this painting, this massive painting of George Washington, was safe. So she had her servants making sure that all of the most important documents and the most important items from history were preserved. And one of those was this great image of George Washington, which says a lot, of course, about Dolly Madison and how awesome she is, that in the face of her house being burnt, she's grabbing the most important artifacts, but also says a lot about George Washington's importance to the new republic, and even to someone like Dolly Madison, who's the wife of a Republican. Now, the last steps are something called the Hartford Convention, which is extremely important in that it's going to set a precedent that I'm going to want you to remember. So the blockade is really hurting trade, as you can imagine, especially those Federalists in New England who make the majority of their money off of trading. And they're going to call this war, the War of 1812, they're going to call it Mr. Madison's War. And in doing so, they make the point that, like, this was his idea. This is only helping him and his party. It's ignoring the needs and desires of the New England states. So in December of 1814, they're going to call a convention, and they're going to call it the Hartford Convention, and at it, a series of New England states are going to consider seceding or withdrawing from the Union. Now, when you think of seceding, I hope that you have a vague understanding of American history, and you think of the South, and when the South chose to secede before the Civil War rather than give up their slaves. But it's interesting for you to note that, in fact, the first threat of secession comes not from the South, but from New England, who, because they say that this war in particular is harming their trade and that it's harmful to them, that they should have a sort of states' rights opportunity to decide that they're not going to partake in it and that they're going to actually leave the Union over it. What actually ends the war? On Christmas Eve at the Treaty of Ghent, which is in Belgium, Great Britain and the United States representatives sit down and they sign a treaty which ends the war. And because the war is now over, this quickly ends this talk of seceding from the Union. But it's important to be aware that states' rights wasn't just a Southern thing, and nor was seceding. We're going to talk more about this political cartoon when I see you in class, but it's worth noting this man here, King George, who is calling for the New England states to jump. Last but not least, the consequences. Some would argue that there are very few consequences of note on this American War for Independence, because if you take a look here, there was no actual winner. The British just got tired, as before, of fighting this war. They grew tired and considered that they've been fighting a protracted war against France. They grew tired of this. So in that sense, there was no real winner, and no territory actually changed hands. They just agreed on both sides to go back to the status before the war. But in some ways, it's really important because it secures our independence from Great Britain, and it shows that we've earned kind of respect from these European nations who may have looked down on us as a newcomer or a new country. We kind of have shown by winning this second war that we deserve some respect. We are also going to talk more about this image when I see you in class. So go ahead and make sure you write your summary, and I will see you there.